It is my opinion, based on just my interaction with folks that I hear from regularly, there is a growing, I don't know how big it is, George Barna has not done this poll yet, there's a growing trend of Christians who are libertarian. They like the Libertarian Party. I took the time to look up the 2012 platform. It's basically about individual sovereignty, that you control your own decisions, and there should be no laws that control your behavior as long as it's peaceful and it doesn't harm anybody. And that includes marijuana, it includes any form of drugs, drug legislation. It also includes abortion. It also includes sexual proclivity or gay marriage. If my assessment is accurate, more Christians are looking toward the Libertarian Party. Is that a place that a Christian should be lending its support, libertarianism?
Oh, that's yours. Well, I think the quick answer is no. I think we have to be very careful here and say, first of all, this libertarian temptation is written into the American experiment. I mean, you can look at some of the Federalist Papers and see that some of our forefathers are making very similar arguments, countered by people who had better arguments, such that there was a boundary established. The conservative coalition in America since 1979 has had as one of its three main legs a libertarian impulse. It's very popular among young people because it basically gives them a way out of the cultural collision. If you're in the cultural vice, the way out of this is to adopt a libertarian understanding. The ideological base of libertarianism is idolatry. It's Ayn Rand. It's Randian individualism, and she was at least honest in saying that she was like Nietzsche, that Christianity is the religion for weak people who need this kind of support. I mean, we need to realize what we're up against, and frankly, we need to call these people who claim to be libertarians and say, look, if you're a libertarian and you're buying into that, then you're denying the gospel by doing so. Not all libertarians do that. Not all people who are tempted by libertarian arguments do that. But I think we need to recognize that the ideology there is very, very difficult. Now, we come back to say that the alternative to libertarianism is not a dictatorship. It's not giving the state the kind of sovereignty the state wants to claim over our lives. That's the balancing problem, is that we have an encroaching state that genuinely does want to control every aspect of our lives. And this is something that, in other words, the libertarian impulse has checked that statist impulse on the part of others, but this is where we have to be continually negotiating these things in the public square.
Yeah, because I've made some of those statements, and then I get emails back. This is the response. Wait a second. It is not the government's job to be legislating morality. It's the church's job to be proclaiming the gospel, to be proclaiming the truth, and there should be that separation, and government should not be making those laws regarding abortion, drugs, sexuality. The Christian response would be?
First of all, that's insane, but there are smart ways to make that argument. That's just not the smart way of making it. You were smart to make it in the unsmart way, to make its unsmartness apparent.
That was so smart I didn't understand that, but okay.
In other words, first of all, it is the church's responsibility to preach the gospel. It is not we shouldn't expect the government ever to preach the gospel. The government's responsibility is to get out of our way to allow the church to preach the gospel. And by the way, we've counted on the culture helping us to preach the gospel, and the culture's not helping us anymore. Cultural Christianity is disappearing, and we're finding out we're now the only people who are going to be talking about the gospel, and we're going to find out there are a lot of people who thought they were talking about the gospel who weren't. We're the people who know the gospel, preach the gospel, will die for the gospel, bleed out for the gospel. But the government legislates morality all the time. That's all the government actually does in legislation. The laws regarding traffic are moral laws. They're establishing a moral universe in which it's right to have respect in this way for others on the road. Everything the government does is legislating morality. When people say that, they're talking about a zone of specific morality having to do with individual, usually political, economic, or sexual behaviors. And then they're saying, well, there you have to be hands-off. But here again, the people who are saying that don't mean it. I mean, you do not have people who are right now saying we need to stop legislating all sexual morality. They're not trying to decriminalize issues having to do with incest or all kinds of things we could mention. The Bible's very candid about. And so they'll try to say, well, no, only where we just want to stop moralizing where there are consenting adults involved. Well, but even then, they're not really consistent with that. We need to call them on their inconsistency. Governments always, cultures always moralize. In New York City, they've stopped moralizing on pornography and they started moralizing on supersized Cokes. And so, every society decides to moralize by its regulations. So we have to stop legislating morality. It's wrong to have that many calories. You're rotting the teeth of children and making them obese. And so, you just have this negotiated all the time. But we just need to look at people and say, you don't legislate morality, and say, well, what in the world do legislators do? If this isn't about a moral purpose, then what are you doing? Now, sometimes that moral purpose is a little more abstract, but that is the purpose for the legislation, and we need to call it. But the church preaches the gospel. We shouldn't count on the government to do it. We should tell the government not to do it, as a matter of fact. That's our job. That's our responsibility. But the government does have a responsibility to, as Romans 13 makes very clear, to execute justice. That's morality. There are limits to what government can do, but government needs to fulfill that purpose.